Imagine standing at the edge of destiny, where one man's final words would echo through eternity. Deuteronomy isn't just another book, it's the pivotal moment that shapes everything. Here, Moses delivers humanity's most crucial choice: life or death, blessing or curse. This book predicts Israel's future with shocking accuracy, establishes the foundation for all biblical prophecy, and reveals God's ultimate plan for redemption. Jesus quoted it more than any other book. Kings rose and fell by its words. Nations were born from its promises. What you're about to discover will revolutionize how you see Scripture itself. The future of humanity was decided here, in these final speeches of the greatest prophet who ever lived. Are you ready to witness the moment that changed everything? The sun was setting over the wilderness as Moses stood before an enormous crowd. After 40 long years of wandering, the people of Israel had finally reached the Plains of Moab. They could see the promised land just across the Jordan River, so close they could almost touch it. But Moses knew something they didn't. He would never cross that river with them. In the first chapter of Deuteronomy, verse 1, we read that Moses spoke to all Israel beyond the Jordan in the wilderness. This wasn't just another ordinary gathering. This was the moment Moses had been preparing for his entire life. He was 120 years old, and God had already told him his time was coming to an end. The location was carefully chosen. They were in the land of Moab, opposite Beth Peor, near Suf, between Paran and Tophel, Laban, Hazeroth, and Dizahab. These weren't random places. Each location held memories of God's faithfulness and Israel's struggles during their journey. Moses looked out at the sea of faces before him. These weren't the same people who had left Egypt 40 years earlier. Most of the older generation had died in the wilderness because of their rebellion. Now he was speaking to their children and grandchildren, a new generation who had grown up hearing stories of Egypt but had never lived as slaves themselves. As chapter 1, verse 3 tells us, it was the 40th year, in the 11th month, on the first day of the month, that Moses spoke to the children of Israel according to all that the Lord had given him as commandments to them. The timing was perfect. They had just defeated two powerful kings east of the Jordan, and their confidence was high. It was time for Moses to pass on everything God had taught him. He began to speak, and his voice carried across the vast assembly. These would be his final words to the nation he had led for 4 decades. Every word mattered. Every story he was about to tell would shape how they understood their identity and their future. Moses' mind drifted back to where it all began. Mount Horeb, the mountain of God. That's where everything changed for Israel. As he recounted in chapter 1, verse 6, the Lord their God spoke to them at Horeb, saying they had dwelt long enough at this mountain. Picture the scene. Israel had been camped at the base of Mount Sinai for almost a year. They had received the 10 Commandments, built the tabernacle, and learned how to worship God properly. But God never intended for them to stay there forever. He had bigger plans. The command was simple and direct, as Moses explained in verses 7 and 8. Turn and take your journey, and go to the mountains of the Amorites, to all the neighboring places in the plain, in the mountains and in the lowland, in the south and on the seashore, to the land of the Canaanites and to Lebanon, as far as the great river, the river Euphrates. See, I have set the land before you. Go in and possess the land which the Lord swore to your fathers. This wasn't just a suggestion, it was a divine command. God was literally telling them to pack up and move toward their destiny. The land was already theirs by promise. They just had to go and take it. But Moses knew that leading over 2 million people wasn't a job for one man. So he reminded them how he had told them in verse 9, I cannot alone bear you. The burden was too heavy for one person to carry. He needed help. That's when Moses had set up a system of leadership. He told them to choose wise, understanding, and knowledgeable men from their tribes, and he would make them heads over them. As verse 13 records, they answered and said it was a good thing to do. So Moses took the heads of their tribes, wise and knowledgeable men, and made them heads over them. Leaders of thousands, leaders of hundreds, leaders of 50s, leaders of 10s, and officers for their tribes. This wasn't just about organization, it was about preparing them for the challenges ahead. He charged these judges in verse 17, saying they should not show partiality in judgment, but hear the small as well as the great. They should not be afraid in any man's presence, for the judgment belonged to God. This was serious business. They were representing God's justice to his people. Moses' voice grew heavy as he continued his story. What happened next was one of the most heartbreaking moments in Israel's history. They had come so close to entering the promised land, but fear destroyed everything. As Moses recounted in chapter 1, verse 19, they departed from Horeb and went through all that great and terrible wilderness. When they came to Cadesh Barnea, Moses told them in verse 21 that the Lord their God had set the land before them, and they should go up and possess it as the Lord God of their fathers had spoken to them. They shouldn't fear or be discouraged. But the people weren't satisfied with God's word alone. In verse 22, they came near to Moses and said they wanted to send men before them to search out the land and bring back word of the way they should go up and the cities they would come to. The plan seemed reasonable to Moses. So he took 12 men from them, 1 man from each tribe. These men went up into the mountains and came to the valley of Eshcol and spied it out. They even brought back fruit from the land in their hands and said in verse 25 that it was a good land which the Lord their God was giving them. Everything should have gone perfectly from there. They had proof that the land was good, just as God had promised. But that's when fear took over. The spies came back with terrifying reports. Yes, the land was good, but the people who lived there were strong, and their cities were great and fortified. They had seen the descendants of Anak there, giants who made them feel like grasshoppers. In verse 26, Moses sadly recalled that they would not go up, but rebelled against the commandment of the Lord their God. Instead of trusting in God's power, they complained in their tents and said in verse 27 that the Lord hated them and had brought them out of the land of Egypt to deliver them into the hand of the Amorites. To destroy them, the people's fear spread like wildfire. They asked where they could go up, saying their brethren had discouraged their hearts by reporting that the people were greater and taller than them. The cities were great and fortified up to heaven, and they had seen the sons of the Anakim there. Moses tried to encourage them. In verse 29, he said they should not be terrified or afraid of them. The Lord their God, who went before them, would fight for them, according to all he had done for them in Egypt, before their eyes, and in the wilderness where they had seen how the Lord their God carried them, as a man carries his son, in all the way that they went until they came to this place. But it was too late. The damage was done. Even with all these reassurances, verse 32 tells us that in this thing, and they did not believe the Lord their God. The consequences of that moment of unbelief were swift and severe. Moses' voice carried the weight of 40 years of sorrow as he continued the story. God's anger burned against that generation, and he made a solemn oath that would change everything. In verse 34, Moses explained that the Lord heard the sound of their words and was angry, and swore an oath, saying that certainly none of these men of this evil generation would see that good land which he swore to give to their fathers. Only Caleb would see it, because he had wholly followed the Lord. The Lord was also angry with Moses for their sake, saying in verse 37 that he also would not go in there. Instead, Joshua, who stood before him, would go in there, and Moses should encourage him, for he would cause Israel to inherit it. But there was hope for the future. The little ones who they said would be victims, their children who today had no knowledge of good and evil, they would go in there. To them, God would give it, and they would possess it. This began the longest time out in human history. As Moses recounted in chapter 2, verse 1, they turned and journeyed into the wilderness by the way of the Red Sea, as the Lord spoke to him. And they skirted Mount Seir for many days. For nearly 4 decades, they wandered in circles. It wasn't aimless wandering, though. God was teaching them lessons they couldn't learn any other way. He was preparing a new generation who would trust him completely. In verse 7, Moses reminded them that the Lord their God had blessed them in all the work of their hands. He knew their trudging through this great wilderness. These 40 years the Lord their God had been with them, and they lacked nothing. It was a time of testing, but also a time of provision. God's presence never left them. Their clothes didn't wear out. Their feet didn't swell. Every day, manna fell from heaven to feed them. Water flowed from rocks to quench their thirst. The older generation gradually passed away, exactly as God had said they would. It was sad, but it was also necessary. The new generation was watching and learning. They were seeing that God always keeps his word, whether it's a promise or a warning. Moses told them in verse 14 that the time they took to come from Cadesh Barnea until they crossed over the valley of the Zered was 38 years. But now, Moses' tone changed completely. The sadness was replaced with excitement as he told them about their recent victories. After 40 years of wandering, God was finally ready to give them some wins. The time of discipline was over, and the time of conquest was beginning. As they approached the land of the Amorites, Moses told them in chapter 2, verse 24, that they should rise, take their journey, and cross over the river Arnon. God had given into their hand Sihon the Amorite, king of Heshbon, and his land. They should begin to possess it and engage him in battle. This was the moment everything changed. For 40 years, they had been told to avoid conflict with other nations. Now God was telling them to fight. It was a sign that their time of waiting was over. Moses sent messengers from the wilderness of Kedemoth to Sihon, king of Heshbon, with words of peace, saying in verse 27 that they would like to pass through his land on the highway and would not turn aside to the right hand or to the left. He would sell them food for money that they might eat, and give them water for money that they might drink. They only wanted to pass through on foot. It seemed like a reasonable request. They weren't asking for anything for free. They just wanted safe passage through his territory. But Sihon's heart was hardened by the Lord, as verse 30 explains, because the Lord wanted to deliver him into their hand. Sihon refused their request and came out against them with all his people to fight at Jahaz. But the Lord their God delivered him over to them, and they defeated him, his sons, and all his people. At that time they took all his cities, and they utterly destroyed the men, women, and children of every city. They left none remaining. The victory was complete and total. They only took the livestock as plunder for themselves, and the spoil of the cities which they took. From Aroer, which is on the bank of the river Arnon, and from the city that is in the ravine, as far as Gilead, there was not one city too strong for them. The Lord their God delivered all to them. But that was just the beginning. Next came an even bigger challenge, Og, king of Bashan. This king was a giant among giants, and his kingdom seemed impossible to conquer. But God had other plans. In chapter 3, verse 1, Moses recounted how they turned and went up the road to Bashan. So Og, king of Bashan, came out against them, he and all his people, to battle at Edrei. But the Lord said to Moses in verse 2 that he should not fear him, for he had delivered him and all his people and his land into his hand. He should do to him as he had done to Sihon, king of the Amorites, who dwelt at Heshbon. The battle was even more decisive than the first one. They utterly destroyed them. As verse 6 explains, they utterly destroyed the men, women, and children of every city, just as they had done to Sihon, king of Heshbon. But all the livestock and the spoil of the cities they took as booty for themselves. When the dust settled, they had conquered an enormous territory. They took all his cities at that time. There was not a city which they did not take from them. 60 cities, all the region of Argob, the kingdom of Og in Bashan. With these massive victories fresh in everyone's memory, it was time to make some important decisions. Moses knew his time was running short, and there were practical matters that needed to be settled before they crossed the Jordan. The tribes of Reuben and Gad came to Moses with a request. They had large herds of livestock, and the land they had just conquered was perfect for raising cattle. In verse 12, Moses explained how he gave this land at that time. From Aroer, which is by the river Arnon, and half the mountains of Gilead and its cities, he gave to the Reubenites and the Gadites. The rest of Gilead and all Bashan, the kingdom of Og, he gave to half the tribe of Manasseh. This was prime real estate, some of the best grazing land in the region. But there was one important condition attached to this gift. Moses commanded them at that time, saying in verse 18 that the Lord their God had given them this land to possess. All who were men of valor should cross over armed before their brethren, the children of Israel. Only their wives, their little ones, and their livestock should stay in the cities which he had given them, until the Lord had given rest to their brethren as to them. And they also possessed the land which the Lord their God was giving them beyond the Jordan. Then each man could return to his possession which Moses had given him. This was a test of their unity as a nation. Even though these tribes had received their inheritance early, they couldn't just settle down and forget about their brothers. They had to help finish the job of conquering the promised land. But Moses also knew that his own role in this story was coming to an end. In verse 23, he told them how he pleaded with the Lord at that time, saying in verse 24, "O Lord God, you have begun to show your servant your greatness and your mighty hand. For what God is there in heaven or on earth who can do anything like your works and your mighty deeds?" Moses desperately wanted to see the promised land. He begged God in verse 25, "I pray, let me cross over and see the good land beyond the Jordan, those pleasant mountains and Lebanon." After everything he had been through with this people, after 40 years of leading them through the wilderness, he wanted to see the end of the story. But God's answer was firm and final. The Lord was angry with Moses for their sake and would not listen to him. Instead, God told him in verse 27 to go up to the top of Pisgah and lift up his eyes toward the west, the north, the south, and the east. Behold it with his eyes, for he would not cross over this Jordan. The leadership transition was beginning. Moses was commanded to encourage Joshua and strengthen him, for he would go over before this people, and he would cause them to inherit the land which Moses would see. As Moses continued his speech, his focus shifted from the past to the future. He had told them where they had been and what God had done for them. Now he needed to prepare them for what was coming next. The lessons of the wilderness were about to be tested in a whole new way. In chapter 4, verse 1, Moses' voice became urgent. "Now, O Israel, listen to the statutes and the judgments which I teach you to observe. that you may live, and go in and possess the land which the Lord God of your fathers is giving you." This wasn't just good advice, it was a matter of life and death. Everything depended on their willingness to obey God's commands completely. Moses warned them in verse 2 not to add to the word which he commanded them, nor take from it, that they might keep the commandments of the Lord their God, which he commanded them. They had already seen what happened when people disobeyed God. Moses reminded them in verse 3 that their eyes had seen what the Lord did at Baal Peor. For the Lord their God destroyed from among them all the men who followed Baal of Peor. But those who held fast to the Lord their God were alive, every one of them, that day. The contrast couldn't be clearer. Obedience led to life and blessing. Disobedience led to death and destruction. There was no middle ground with God. Moses told them in verse 5 that he had taught them statutes and judgments, just as the Lord his God commanded him, that they should act according to them in the land which they were going to possess. This wasn't human wisdom. This was divine instruction for how to live successfully in the promised land. He encouraged them in verse 6 to observe and do them carefully, for this would be their wisdom and their understanding in the sight of the peoples who would hear all these statutes and say, "Surely this great nation is a wise and understanding people." Other nations would be watching them. If they followed God's laws, the whole world would see the difference and be amazed. They would become a living advertisement for the wisdom and goodness of their God. Moses asked them in verse 7, "For what great nation is there that has God so near to it, as the Lord our God is to us? For whatever reason we may call upon him." No other people in history had ever experienced the kind of relationship with God that Israel enjoyed. And what great nation was there that had such statutes and righteous judgments as all this law which Moses set before them that day? God's laws weren't burdensome restrictions. They were the secret to national success and prosperity. But Moses also gave them a sobering warning. He told them in verse 9 to take heed to themselves and diligently keep their souls, lest they forget the things their eyes had seen, and lest they depart from their hearts all the days of their lives. They should teach them to their children and their grandchildren. Before Moses finished this section of his speech, he needed to address some practical matters and remind them of the foundation of their relationship with God. The conquest was coming, but they needed to be prepared for life after the victory. In verse 41, Moses set apart 3 cities on the east side of the Jordan, toward the rising of the sun, that the manslayer might flee there, who kills his neighbor unintentionally, without having hated him in time past, and that by fleeing to one of these cities he might live. These cities of refuge were an amazing demonstration of God's mercy. Even in cases of accidental death, there was provision for justice and protection. The cities were Bezer in the wilderness on the plateau for the Reubenites, Ramoth in Gilead for the Gadites, and Golan in Bashan for the Manassites. But Moses knew that practical laws meant nothing without a proper understanding of their relationship with God. So he took them back to the beginning, to Mount Horeb, where everything started. In chapter 5, verse 2, Moses declared that the Lord their God made a covenant with them in Horeb. This wasn't ancient history. It was the living foundation of their national identity. The Lord didn't make this covenant with their fathers, but with them, those who were there alive that day. Moses reminded them that the Lord talked with them face to face on the mountain from the midst of the fire. He stood between the Lord and them at that time to declare to them the word of the Lord. For they were afraid because of the fire and did not go up the mountain. Then Moses repeated the 10 Commandments in full, exactly as God had spoken them from the mountain. These weren't suggestions or guidelines. They were the fundamental laws that would govern their society. When Moses finished reciting them, he told them in verse 22 that these words the Lord spoke to all their assembly in the mountain from the midst of the fire, the cloud, and the thick darkness, with a loud voice. And he added no more. He wrote them on 2 tablets of stone and gave them to Moses. The people's response to hearing God's voice directly was immediate and intense. In verse 24, they said that the Lord their God had shown them his glory and his greatness, and they had heard his voice from the midst of the fire. They had seen that day that God speaks with man, yet he still lives. But they were also terrified. They asked Moses in verse 25 why they should die. For this great fire would consume them. If they heard the voice of the Lord their God anymore, then they would die. They begged Moses to go near and hear all that the Lord their God might say, and speak to them all that the Lord their God would speak to him, and they would hear and do it. God was pleased with their response. In verse 28, the Lord heard the voice of their words when they spoke to Moses. And the Lord said to him, I have heard the voice of the words of this people which they have spoken to you. They are right in all that they have spoken. But God also knew their hearts. He continued in verse 29, Oh, that they had such a heart in them that they would fear me and always keep all my commandments, that it might be well with them and with their children forever. Moses shifted his tone as he began to speak about something deeply personal to every person standing before him. The wilderness years weren't just ancient history. They were the defining experience of this generation. Every scar, every lesson, every moment of God's provision had shaped who they were. In chapter 8, verse 2, Moses told them to remember that the Lord their God led them all the way these 40 years in the wilderness, to humble them and test them, to know what was in their heart, whether they would keep his commandments or not. This wasn't random suffering. It was purposeful training. The testing had been intense and personal. Moses explained in verse 3 that God humbled them, allowed them to hunger, and fed them with manna which they did not know, nor did their fathers know, that he might make them know that man shall not live by bread alone, but man lives by every word that proceeds from the mouth of the Lord. Think about it. An entire generation had grown up eating food that fell from the sky every morning. They had never planted crops, never harvested grain, never baked bread the normal way. God had fed them supernaturally for 4 decades to teach them a simple truth. They needed his word more than they needed food. The miracles hadn't stopped with food. Moses reminded them in verse 4 that their garments did not wear out on them, nor did their feet swell these 40 years. Imagine wearing the same clothes for 40 years and having them look brand new every day. Their shoes never got holes. Their feet never got blisters from walking thousands of miles through the desert. But Moses wanted them to understand the deeper purpose behind all these miracles. In verse 5, he told them to know in their heart that as a man chastens his son, so the Lord their God chastens them. This wasn't punishment for punishment's sake. It was a loving father preparing his children for their inheritance. The land they were about to enter would test them in completely different ways. Moses described it in verse 7 as a good land, a land of brooks of water, of fountains and springs that flow out of valleys and hills. It was a land of wheat and barley, of vines and fig trees and pomegranates, a land of olive oil and honey. It was a land in which they would eat bread without scarcity, in which they would lack nothing. But this abundance would bring its own dangers. Moses warned them in verse 11 to beware that they did not forget the Lord their God by not keeping his commandments, his judgments, and his statutes, which he commanded them that day. As Moses looked toward the future, he could see a dangerous trap waiting for them. Success had a way of making people forget where their strength really came from. He had seen it happen before, and he was determined to warn them about it. In chapter 9, verse 1, Moses told them to hear, "O Israel, they were to cross over the Jordan today and go in to dispossess nations greater and mightier than themselves, cities great and fortified up to heaven." The people they were about to face weren't weak or defenseless. They were powerful and well-established. The Anakim were there, the same giants that had terrified their parents' generation. Moses acknowledged in verse 2 that these were a people great and tall, the descendants of the Anakim, whom they knew and of whom they heard it said, "Who can stand before the descendants of Anak?" But Moses had incredible news for them. In verse 3, he declared that they should understand today that the Lord their God was the one who crossed over before them as a consuming fire. He would destroy them and bring them down before them, so they would drive them out and destroy them quickly, as the Lord had said to them. This was the key truth they needed to remember. The victory wouldn't come from their own strength or skill. God would win the battles for them, just as he had done with Sihon and Og. But Moses knew human nature too well. He warned them in verse 4 not to speak in their heart after the Lord their God had cast them out from before them, saying that because of their righteousness, the Lord had brought them in to possess this land. The truth was exactly the opposite. It was because of the wickedness of these nations that the Lord was driving them out from before them. Moses was brutally honest with them. In verse 5, he told them it was not because of their righteousness or the uprightness of their heart that they were going in to possess their land, but because of the wickedness of these nations that the Lord their God drove them out from before them, and that he might fulfill the word which the Lord swore to their fathers, to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He wanted to make this crystal clear, so he repeated it again in verse 6. They should understand that the Lord their God was not giving them this good land to possess because of their righteousness, for they were a stiff-necked people. To prove his point, Moses reminded them of their track record. He told them in verse 7 to remember and not forget how they provoked the Lord their God to wrath in the wilderness. From the day that they departed from the land of Egypt until they came to this place, they had been rebellious against the Lord. The worst example was what happened at Mount Horeb itself. Moses recounted in verse 8 how even at Horeb they provoked the Lord to wrath, so that the Lord was angry enough with them to have destroyed them. This was at the very place where they had received the 10 Commandments, and they had immediately broken them by making a golden calf. Moses' voice grew softer as he remembered one of the most painful moments of his entire life. He had gone up on the mountain to receive God's law, only to come down and find the people worshiping an idol. What happened next showed both the terror of God's judgment and the miracle of his mercy. In verse 9, Moses explained that when he went up into the mountain to receive the tablets of stone, the tablets of the covenant which the Lord made with them, he stayed on the mountain 40 days and 40 nights. He neither ate bread nor drank water during this entire time. The Lord delivered to him 2 tablets of stone written with the finger of God, and on them were all the words which the Lord had spoken to them on the mountain from the midst of the fire in the day of the assembly. But when Moses came down from the mountain, what he saw broke his heart. Moses told them in verse 12 that the Lord said to him to arise and go down quickly from there. For their people whom he brought out of Egypt had acted corruptly. They had turned aside quickly from the way which he commanded them, and had made themselves a molded image. God's anger was terrifying. In verse 14, the Lord told Moses to let him alone, that he might destroy them and blot out their name from under heaven. And he would make of Moses a nation mightier and greater than they. But Moses did something incredible. Instead of accepting God's offer to make him the father of a new nation, he interceded for the people. He fell down before the Lord, as at the first, 40 days and 40 nights. He neither ate bread nor drank water, because of all their sin which they committed in doing wickedly in the sight of the Lord, to provoke him to anger. Moses was terrified for them. In verse 19, he said he was afraid of the anger and hot displeasure with which the Lord was angry with them, to destroy them. But the Lord listened to him at that time also. The prayer worked. God's mercy triumphed over his wrath. In chapter 10, verse 1, the Lord told Moses to hew 2 tablets of stone like the first, and come up to him on the mountain, and make himself an ark of wood. God would write on the tablets the words that were on the first tablets, which Moses broke, and he should put them in the ark. Moses did exactly as God commanded. He made an ark of acacia wood, hewed 2 tablets of stone like the first, and went up the mountain with the 2 tablets in his hand. The Lord wrote on the tablets, according to the first writing, the 10 commandments which the Lord had spoken to them on the mountain from the midst of the fire in the day of the assembly. And the Lord gave them to Moses. This time, there was no golden calf waiting at the bottom of the mountain. The tablets safely made it into the ark, where verse 5 tells us they remained, as the Lord commanded. Moses' tone became urgent as he moved from the past to the future. Everything he had told them so far was leading up to this moment, the most important choice they would ever make as a nation. The stakes couldn't be higher. In chapter 11, verse 1, Moses commanded them to love the Lord their God and keep his charge, his statutes, his judgments, and his commandments always. This wasn't just a suggestion. It was the foundation of everything else that would happen to them. Moses reminded them that their children hadn't seen what they had seen. In verse 2, he spoke to those who knew and had seen the chastening of the Lord their God, his greatness and his mighty hand and his outstretched arm. They were eyewitnesses to the greatest miracles in history. They had seen his signs and his acts, which he did in the midst of Egypt, to Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and to all his land. They had seen what he did to the army of Egypt, to their horses and their chariots, how he made the waters of the Red Sea overflow them as they pursued after them, and how the Lord had destroyed them to this day. They had also seen what God did to their own people when they rebelled. Moses reminded them in verse 6 of what he did to Dathan and Abiram, the sons of Eliab, the son of Reuben, how the earth opened its mouth and swallowed them up, their households, their tents, and all the substance that was in their possession, in the midst of all Israel. With all this evidence before them, Moses laid out the choice. In verse 8, he told them that they should keep every commandment which he commanded them today, that they might be strong and go in and possess the land which they crossed over to possess. The land itself was at stake. Moses described it in verse 10 as not like the land of Egypt from which they had come, where they sowed their seed and watered it by foot as a vegetable garden. Instead, verse 11 tells us it was a land of hills and valleys, which drank water from the rain of heaven. It was a land for which the Lord their God cared. The eyes of the Lord their God were always on it, from the beginning of the year to the very end of the year. But this blessing came with conditions. In verse 13, Moses explained that if they carefully obeyed his commandments, which he commanded them that day, to love the Lord their God and serve him with all their heart and with all their soul, then he would give them the rain for their land in its season, the early rain and the latter rain, that they might gather in their grain, their new wine, and their oil. The alternative was terrifying. Moses warned them in verse 16 to take heed to themselves, lest their heart be deceived, and they turn aside and serve other gods and worship them, lest the Lord's anger be aroused against them, and he shut up the heavens so that there be no rain, and the land yield no produce, and they perish quickly from the good land which the Lord was giving them. Moses now addressed a crucial issue that would determine how they worshiped God in the Promised Land. Up until this point, they had worshipped at the tabernacle in the wilderness. But once they entered the land, everything would change. In chapter 12, verse 2, Moses commanded them to utterly destroy all the places where the nations which they would dispossess served their gods, on the high mountains and on the hills and under every green tree. These pagan worship sites had to be completely eliminated. They were to destroy their altars, break their sacred pillars, burn their wooden images with fire, cut down the carved images of their gods, and destroy their names from that place. The contamination of false worship had to be removed entirely, but Moses made it clear in verse 4 that they should not worship the Lord their God with such things. God had a different plan for how he wanted to be worshipped. In verse 5, Moses explained that they should seek the place where the Lord their God would choose, out of all their tribes, to put his name for his dwelling place. And there they should go. This was revolutionary. Instead of many worship sites scattered throughout the land, there would be one central location chosen by God himself. To that place, they would bring their burnt offerings, their sacrifices, their tithes, the heave offerings of their hands, their vowed offerings, their free will offerings, and the firstborn of their herds and flocks. There they would eat before the Lord their God, and they would rejoice in all to which they had put their hand, they and their households, in which the Lord their God had blessed them. This was completely different from how they had been living. Moses told them in verse 8 that they should not do according to all the things that they were doing there that day, every man doing whatever was right in his own eyes. In the wilderness, worship had been somewhat informal, but in the Promised Land, everything had to be centralized and organized. Moses emphasized this point again in verse 11. Then there would be the place where the Lord their God would choose to make his name abide. There they would bring all that he commanded them: their burnt offerings, their sacrifices, their tithes, the heave offerings of their hands, and all their choice offerings which they vowed to the Lord. However, Moses made it clear that this didn't mean they could only eat meat at the central sanctuary. In verse 15, he explained that they could slaughter and eat meat within all their gates, whatever their heart desired, according to the blessing of the Lord their God which he had given them. Both the unclean and the clean could eat of it, of the gazelle and the deer alike. The key restriction was about blood. Moses commanded them in verse 16 that they should not eat the blood. They should pour it on the earth like water. This command would be repeated several times because it was so important to God. Moses' voice grew stern as he addressed one of the greatest dangers they would face in the Promised Land. The pagan nations around them would try to seduce them away from the true God through false prophets, lying signs, and even family pressure. In chapter 13, verse 1, Moses warned them that if a prophet or a dreamer of dreams arose among them and gave them a sign or a wonder, and the sign or the wonder came to pass, of which he spoke to them, saying, "Let us go after other gods, which they had not known, and let us serve them," they should not listen to the words of that prophet or that dreamer of dreams. This was a crucial test. Even if someone performed genuine miracles, if they used those miracles to lead people away from God, they were false prophets. Moses explained in verse 3 that the Lord their God was testing them to know whether they loved the Lord their God with all their heart and with all their soul. The response to false prophets had to be swift and decisive. In verse 5, Moses commanded that such a prophet, or that dreamer of dreams, should be put to death, because he had spoken in order to turn them away from the Lord, their God, who brought them out of the land of Egypt and redeemed them from the house of bondage, to entice them from the way in which the Lord their God commanded them to walk. But the temptation to worship other gods might come from even closer sources. Moses warned them in verse 6 that if their brother, the son of their mother, their son or their daughter, the wife of their bosom, or their friend, who was as their own soul, secretly enticed them, saying, "Let us go and serve other gods," which they had not known, neither they nor their fathers, they should not consent to him or listen to him. The command was shocking in its severity. Moses told them in verse 8 that they should not spare him or conceal him, but they should surely kill him. Their hand should be first against him to put him to death, and afterward the hand of all the people. They should stone him with stones until he died, because he sought to entice them away from the Lord their God, who brought them out of the land of Egypt, from the house of bondage. Even entire cities could become corrupted. Moses warned them in verse 12 that if they heard someone say in one of their cities, which the Lord their God gave them to dwell in, that corrupt men had gone out from among them and enticed the inhabitants of their city, saying, "Let us go and serve other gods," they should inquire, search out, and ask diligently. If the report turned out to be true and certain that such an abomination was committed among them, verse 15 commanded them to utterly destroy that city with the edge of the sword, destroying it entirely and all that was in it and its livestock with the edge of the sword. Moses now shifted to explain how God's people should live differently from the nations around them. Their identity as God's children should be visible in every aspect of their daily lives, including what they ate and how they treated their bodies. In chapter 14, verse 1, Moses declared that they were children of the Lord their God. They should not cut themselves, nor shave the front of their heads for the dead. The pagan nations practiced self-mutilation as part of their religious rituals. But God's people were called to something higher. The reason was simple and powerful. Moses told them in verse 2 that they were a holy people to the Lord their God, and the Lord had chosen them to be a people for himself, a special treasure above all the peoples who were on the face of the earth. This special status affected even their diet. Moses commanded them in verse 3 that they should not eat any detestable thing. He then gave them a detailed list of which animals they could and couldn't eat. The clean animals were specified in verse 4: the ox, the sheep, the goat, the deer, the gazelle, the roe deer, the wild goat, the mountain goat, the antelope, and the mountain sheep. Among the animals, whatever divided the hoof, having the hoof split into two parts and chewed the cud, they could eat, but there were important exceptions. Moses listed in verse 7 that they should not eat the camel, the hare, and the rock hyrax, for they chew the cud, but do not have cloven hooves. They were unclean for them. Also, the swine was unclean because it divided the hoof, yet did not chew the cud. The rules for fish were simpler. In verse 9, Moses said they could eat all that had fins and scales, but whatever did not have fins and scales, they should not eat. It was unclean for them. Birds had their own categories. Moses told them in verse 11 that they could eat all clean birds, but he listed many that were forbidden, including the eagle, the vulture, the buzzard, the red kite, the falcon, the kite after their kinds, every raven after its kind, the ostrich, the short-eared owl, the seagull, and the hawk after their kinds. The reason for these dietary laws wasn't explained in detail, but the principle was clear. God's people were to be different from everyone else, even in the most basic aspects of daily life, like eating. Moses concluded this section by explaining God's economic system for the Promised Land. This wasn't just about money. It was about creating a society where worship was supported and no one was left behind. In verse 22, Moses commanded them to truly tithe all the increase of their grain that the field produced year by year. The tithe wasn't optional. It was a fundamental part of their covenant relationship with God. But this tithe had a specific purpose. Moses explained in verse 23 that they should eat before the Lord their God, in the place where he chose to make his name abide. The tithe of their grain and their new wine and their oil, of the firstborn of their herds and their flocks, that they might learn to fear the Lord their God always. However, Moses recognized that not everyone would live close to the central sanctuary. In verse 24, he said that if the journey was too long for them, so that they were not able to carry the tithe, or if the place where the Lord their God chose to put his name was too far from them, when the Lord their God had blessed them, then they should exchange it for money. This money system was practical and flexible. In verse 25, Moses told them to take the money in their hand and go to the place which the Lord their God chose. There they could spend that money for whatever their heart desired. For oxen or sheep, for wine or similar drink, for whatever their heart desired. They should eat there before the Lord their God, and they should rejoice, they and their household. But Moses added an important reminder in verse 27. They should not forsake the Levite who was within their gates, for he had no part nor inheritance with them. The Levites had given up their tribal inheritance to serve in the temple, so the other tribes needed to support them. Every third year had a special purpose. Moses explained in verse 28 that at the end of every third year, and they should bring out the tithe of their produce of that year and store it up within their gates. This special tithe had a broader purpose, to care for the most vulnerable members of society. In verse 29, Moses explained that the Levite, because he had no portion nor inheritance with them, and the stranger and the fatherless and the widow who were within their gates, could come and eat and be satisfied, that the Lord their God might bless them in all the work of their hand, which they did. Moses now turned to one of the most revolutionary economic concepts in human history. What he was about to propose would seem impossible to most societies, but it was part of God's plan to create a nation where no one stayed poor forever. In chapter 15, verse 1, Moses declared that at the end of every 7 years, they should grant a release of debts. This wasn't just a suggestion. It was a divine command that would reshape their entire economy. The details were specific and clear. Moses explained in verse 2 that this was the form of the release. Every creditor who had lent anything to his neighbor should release it. He should not require it of his neighbor or his brother, because it was called the Lord's release. This rule applied only within their community. In verse 3, Moses clarified that of a foreigner they could require it, but they should give up their claim to what was owed by their brother. The principle was simple. God's people should take care of each other in ways that amaze the world. Moses painted a beautiful picture of what this system could accomplish. In verse 4, he said that there need be no poor among them, for the Lord would greatly bless them in the land which the Lord their God was giving them to possess as an inheritance. Imagine a society with no permanent poverty. That was God's vision for Israel. But this blessing came with a condition. Moses continued in verse 5 that this would only happen if they carefully obeyed the voice of the Lord their God, to observe with care all these commandments which he commanded them today. Moses could see into the future and knew that some people would try to get around this law. He warned them in verse 9 to beware lest there be a wicked thought in their heart, saying that the 7th year, the year of release, was at hand, and their eye be evil against their poor brother, and they give him nothing, and he cry out to the Lord against them, and it becomes sin among them. Instead, their attitude should be generous. Moses commanded them in verse 10 to give to him freely, and their heart should not be grieved when they gave to him, because for this thing the Lord their God would bless them in all their works and in all to which they put their hand. Moses was realistic about human nature. In verse 11, he acknowledged that the poor would never cease from the land. Therefore, he commanded them to open their hand wide to their brother, to their poor and their needy, in their land. The law also addressed Hebrew servants. Moses explained in verse 12 that if their brother, a Hebrew man or Hebrew woman, was sold to them and served them 6 years, then in the 7th year they should let him go free from them. But they shouldn't send him away empty-handed. The instructions for release were generous beyond belief. In verse 14, Moses commanded them to supply him liberally from their flock, from their threshing floor, and from their winepress. From what the Lord their God had blessed them with, they should give to him. Moses reminded them of their own history to motivate this generosity. In verse 15, he told them to remember that they were slaves in the land of Egypt, and the Lord their God redeemed them. Therefore, he commanded them this thing today. Moses moved from economic laws to the rhythm of worship and justice that would define their new society. The calendar wasn't just about farming seasons. It was about keeping God at the center of everything they did. In chapter 16, verse 1, Moses commanded them to observe the month of Abib and keep the Passover to the Lord their God. For in the month of Abib, the Lord their God brought them out of Egypt by night. This was their Independence Day, their most important celebration. The Passover had to be celebrated at the central sanctuary. Moses instructed them in verse 2 to sacrifice the Passover to the Lord their God from the flock and the herd in the place where the Lord chose to put his name. The details mattered. Moses told them in verse 3 that they should eat no leavened bread with it. 7 days they should eat unleavened bread with it, that is, the bread of affliction, for they came out of the land of Egypt in haste, that they might remember the day in which they came out of the land of Egypt all the days of their life. 7 weeks later came another celebration. Moses commanded them in verse 9 to count 7 weeks for themselves. They should begin to count the 7 weeks from the time they began to put the sickle to the grain. Then they should keep the Feast of Weeks to the Lord their God with the tribute of a freewill offering from their hand, which they should give as the Lord their God blessed them. The fall brought the final major festival. Moses told them in verse 13 that they should observe the Feast of Tabernacles 7 days. When they had gathered from their threshing floor and from their winepress, these weren't just religious ceremonies. They were times of joy for the whole community. Moses emphasized in verse 14 that they should rejoice in their feast, they and their son and their daughter, their male servant and their female servant and the Levite, the stranger and the fatherless and the widow, who were within their gates. But Moses also knew that festivals alone wouldn't create a just society. They needed good judges throughout the land. In verse 18, he commanded them to appoint judges and officers in all their gates, which the Lord their God gave them according to their tribes, and they should judge the people with just judgment. The standards for justice were absolute. Moses told them in verse 19 that they should not pervert justice. They should not show partiality, nor take a bribe, for a bribe blinds the eyes of the wise and twists the words of the righteous. The goal was simple but profound. In verse 20, Moses declared that they should follow what was altogether just, that they might live and inherit the land which the Lord their God was giving them. Moses understood that a nation needed clear leadership structure, but he also knew the dangers of giving anyone too much power. What he outlined next would prevent tyranny while ensuring effective government. In chapter 17, verse 8, Moses addressed the reality that some legal cases would be too difficult for local judges. If a matter arose which was too hard for them in judgment, between degrees of guilt for bloodshed, between one judgment or another, or between one punishment or another, which were matters of controversy within their gates, then they should arise and go up to the place which the Lord their God chose. The highest court would be at the central sanctuary. Moses explained in verse 9 that they should come to the priests, the Levites, and to the judge there in those days, and inquire of them. They would pronounce upon them the sentence of judgment. The authority of this supreme court was absolute. In verse 10, Moses commanded that they should do according to the sentence which those of that place which the Lord chose would pronounce upon them. They should observe to do according to all that they informed them. But Moses looked even further into the future and saw that Israel would eventually want a king like other nations. When that time came, there would be strict rules. In verse 14, Moses anticipated that when they came to the land which the Lord their God was giving them, and possessed it and dwelt in it, and said that they would set a king over them like all the nations that were around them, they would be allowed to do so. However, not just anyone could be king. Moses specified in verse 15 that they could set a king over them whom the Lord their God chose. One from among their brethren they should set as king over them. They could not set a foreigner over them who was not their brother. The restrictions on royal power were revolutionary for the ancient world. Moses commanded in verse 16 that the king should not multiply horses for himself, nor cause the people to return to Egypt to multiply horses, for the Lord had said to them that they should not return that way again. Personal restraint was also required. In verse 17, Moses said the king should not multiply wives for himself, lest his heart turn away, nor should he greatly multiply silver and gold for himself. Most importantly, the king had to be subject to God's law. Moses commanded in verse 18 that when he sat on the throne of his kingdom, he should write for himself a copy of this law in a book. From the one before the priests, the Levites. The priests had their own specific role. In chapter 18, verse 1, Moses explained that the priests, the Levites, all the tribe of Levi, should have no part nor inheritance with Israel. They should eat the offerings of the Lord made by fire and his portion. God would provide for them in a different way. Moses said in verse 2 that they should have no inheritance among their brethren. The Lord was their inheritance, as he said to them. The people were required to support the priests. Moses specified in verse 3 that this should be the priest's due from the people, from those who offered a sacrifice, whether it was bull or sheep. They should give to the priest the shoulder, the cheeks, and the stomach. Moses now addressed one of the most challenging aspects of justice: what to do when someone accidentally killed another person. The law he was about to give would revolutionize how societies handled unintentional homicide. In chapter 19, verse 2, Moses commanded that when the Lord their God had cut off the nations whose land the Lord their God was giving them, and they dispossessed them and dwelt in their cities and in their houses, they should separate 3 cities for themselves in the midst of their land, which the Lord their God was giving them to possess. These cities had a specific purpose. Moses explained in verse 3 that they should prepare roads for themselves and divide into 3 parts the territory of their land, which the Lord their God was giving them to inherit, that any manslayer might flee there. The law was carefully designed to distinguish between murder and accident. In verse 4, Moses defined who could use these cities. Whoever killed his neighbor unintentionally, without having hated him in time past, could flee there and live. Moses gave a specific example in verse 5. When a man went to the woods with his neighbor to cut timber, and his hand swung a stroke with the axe to cut down the tree, and the head slipped from the handle and struck his neighbor so that he died, he should flee to one of these cities and live. Without these cities, tragic accidents could lead to blood feuds. Moses explained in verse 6 that otherwise the avenger of blood, while his anger was hot, might pursue the manslayer and overtake him, because the way was long, and kill him, though he was not deserving of death, since he had not hated the victim in time past. But Moses also looked to the future, when Israel would expand. In verse 8, he said that if the Lord their God enlarged their territory, as he swore to their fathers, and gave them the land which he promised to give to their fathers, and if they kept all these commandments and did them, which he commanded them today, to love the Lord their God and to walk always in his ways, then they should add 3 more cities for themselves besides these 3. However, these cities weren't meant to protect murderers. Moses was clear in verse 11 that if anyone hated his neighbor, lay in wait for him, rose against him, and struck him mortally, so that he died, and he fled to one of these cities, then the elders of his city should send and bring him from there, and deliver him over to the hand of the avenger of blood, that he might die. The protection of innocent life required strict standards of evidence. Moses established in verse 15 that one witness should not rise against a man concerning any iniquity or any sin that he committed. By the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses, the matter should be established. False witnesses were dealt with severely. Moses commanded in verse 18 that the judges should make careful inquiry. And indeed, if the witness was a false witness, who had testified falsely against his brother, then they should do to him as he thought to have done to his brother. So they would put away the evil from among them. Moses turned to a topic that would soon become very relevant: how God's people should conduct themselves in war. The rules he was about to give would make Israel's military practices unique among all ancient nations. In chapter 20, verse 1, Moses told them that when they went out to battle against their enemies and saw horses and chariots and people more numerous than they should not be afraid of them. For the Lord their God, who brought them up from the land of Egypt, was with them. Before any battle, there would be a special ceremony. Moses explained in verse 2 that when they were on the verge of battle, the priest should approach and speak to the people. The priest would say to them in verse 3, "Hear, O Israel, today you are on the verge of battle with your enemies. Do not let your heart faint, do not be afraid, and do not tremble or be terrified because of them." The reason for confidence was clear. In verse 4, the priest would continue, "For the Lord your God is he who goes with you, to fight for you against your enemies, to save you." But not everyone was required to fight. Moses outlined several exemptions in verse 5. The officers would speak to the people, saying, "What man is there who has built a new house and has not dedicated it? Let him go and return to his house, lest he die in the battle and another man dedicate it." The exemptions continued in verse 6. Also, what man is there who has planted a vineyard and has not eaten of it? Let him go and return to his house, lest he die in the battle and another man eat of it. Even personal relationships mattered. In verse 7, Moses added, "And what man is there who is betrothed to a woman and has not married her? Let him go and return to his house, lest he die in the battle and another man marry her." Fear was also grounds for exemption. The officers would say in verse 8, "What man is there who is fearful and faint-hearted? Let him go and return to his house, lest the heart of his brethren faint like his heart." The rules for siege warfare were surprisingly merciful. Moses commanded in verse 10 that when they went near a city to fight against it, they should proclaim an offer of peace to it. If the city accepted peace and opened to them, then all the people who were found in it should become their laborers and serve them. However, if the city refused peace, they would besiege it. Moses explained in verse 12 that if the city would not make peace with them, but made war against them, then they should besiege it. When the Lord their God delivered it into their hands, they should strike every male in it with the edge of the sword. Even in conquest, there were limits. Moses commanded in verse 19 that when they besieged a city for a long time, while making war against it to take it, they should not destroy its trees by wielding an axe against them. If they could eat of them, they should not cut them down to use in the siege. For the tree of the field was man's food. Moses now addressed some of the most difficult situations a society could face: crimes without obvious perpetrators and complex family relationships. The laws he gave would ensure that justice was pursued even in the most challenging circumstances. In chapter 21, verse 1, Moses dealt with a disturbing scenario. If anyone was found slain, lying in the field in the land which the Lord their God was giving them to possess, and it was not known who killed him, then their elders and judges should go out and measure the distance from the slain man to the surrounding cities. The community nearest to the victim had a responsibility. Moses explained in verse 3 that the elders of the city nearest to the slain man should take a heifer which had never worked and which had not pulled a yoke. The elders of that city should bring the heifer down to a valley with flowing water, which was neither plowed nor sown, and they should break the heifer's neck there in the valley. This wasn't just a ritual. It was a solemn declaration of innocence. The priests, the sons of Levi, would come near in verse 5. For the Lord their God had chosen them to minister to him and to bless in the name of the Lord. By their word, every controversy and every assault should be settled. All the elders of that city nearest to the slain man would wash their hands over the heifer whose neck was broken in the valley. Then they would answer and say in verse 7, "Our hands have not shed this blood, nor have our eyes seen it." The prayer that followed was a plea for mercy. In verse 8 they would say, "Provide atonement, O Lord, for your people Israel, whom you have redeemed, and do not lay innocent blood to the charge of your people Israel." And atonement would be provided on their behalf for the blood. Moses then addressed marriage laws for wartime. In verse 10, he said that when they went out to war against their enemies, and the Lord their God delivered them into their hands, and they took them captive, and they saw among the captives a beautiful woman, and desired her, and would take her for their wife, then they should bring her home to their house. But there were specific procedures to follow. Moses commanded in verse 12 that she should shave her head and trim her nails. She should put off the clothes of her captivity, remain in their house, and mourn her father and her mother a full month. After that, they could go into her and be her husband, and she should be their wife. If the marriage didn't work out, the woman still had rights. Moses explained in verse 14 that if they had no delight in her, then they should set her free, but they certainly should not sell her for money. They should not treat her brutally, because they had humbled her. Moses also addressed inheritance issues in families with multiple wives. In verse 15, he said that if a man had two wives, one loved and the other unloved, and they had borne him children, both the loved and the unloved, and if the firstborn son was of her who was unloved, then it should be, on the day he bequeathed his possessions to his sons, that he could not bestow firstborn status on the son of the loved wife in preference to the son of the unloved, the true firstborn. Moses now tackled one of the most painful situations any parent could face: a child who completely rejected their authority and became a danger to society. The law he was about to give would shock modern readers, but it reflected the seriousness of family order in ancient society. In verse 18, Moses addressed the case of a man who had a stubborn and rebellious son who would not obey the voice of his father or the voice of his mother, and who, when they had chastened him, would not heed them. This wasn't about ordinary childhood misbehavior. This was about a son who had become completely uncontrollable. The parents couldn't just handle this privately. Moses commanded in verse 19 that his father and his mother should take hold of him and bring him out to the elders of his city, to the gate of his city. They would say to the elders in verse 20, "This son of ours is stubborn and rebellious. He will not obey our voice. He is a glutton and a drunkard." The consequence was severe. Moses declared in verse 21 that all the men of his city should stone him to death with stones. So they would put away the evil from among them, and all Israel would hear and fear. Moses also addressed the treatment of executed criminals. In verse 22, he said that if a man had committed a sin deserving of death, and he was put to death, and they hanged him on a tree, his body should not remain overnight on the tree, but they should surely bury him that day, so that their land would not be defiled. For he who was hanged was accursed of God. This showed respect for human dignity even in death. No matter how terrible someone's crime had been, they were still created in God's image, and their body deserved proper treatment. Moses concluded this section of laws by addressing the everyday situations that would test their character as a community. These weren't dramatic cases of murder or rebellion. They were the small choices that would reveal whether they truly cared about each other. The principle of looking out for your neighbor started with the simplest things. Moses would later explain in chapter 22, verse 1, that they should not see their brother's ox or his sheep going astray and hide themselves from them. They should certainly bring them back to their brother. If their brother was not near them, or if they did not know him, then they should bring it to their own house, and it should remain with them until their brother sought it. Then they should restore it to him. This same principle applied to all lost property. Moses would command that they should do the same with their brother's donkey, and so they should do with their brother's garment. With any lost thing of their brother's, which he had lost and they had found, they should do likewise. They could not hide themselves. The responsibility extended to helping in times of need. Moses would say that they should not see their brother's donkey or his ox fall down along the road and hide themselves from them. They should surely help him lift them up again. Even clothing would reflect God's created order. Moses would command that a woman should not wear anything that pertained to a man, nor should a man put on a woman's garment, for all who did so were an abomination to the Lord their God. The laws even protected animal life. Moses would say that if they came across a bird's nest along the way in any tree or on the ground, with young ones or eggs, with the mother sitting on the young or on the eggs, they should not take the mother with the young. They should surely let the mother go, and take the young for themselves, that it might be well with them and that they might prolong their days. Moses continued his detailed instructions for life in the Promised Land, focusing on the daily interactions that would define their character as God's people. These weren't grand theological principles. They were practical rules that would touch every aspect of ordinary life. In chapter 22, verse 1, Moses commanded that they should not see their brother's ox or his sheep going astray and hide themselves from them. They should certainly bring them back to their brother. This simple law established a fundamental principle. They were responsible for each other's welfare, even in the smallest matters. But Moses knew that sometimes the owner might not be easily found. In verse 2, he said that if their brother was not near them, or if they did not know him, then they should bring the animal to their own house, and it should remain with them until their brother sought it. Then they should restore it to him. This principle extended to all lost property. Moses explained in verse 3 that they should do the same with their brother's donkey, and so they should do with their brother's garment. With any lost thing of their brother's, which he had lost and they had found, they should do likewise. They could not hide themselves. The responsibility didn't stop with lost animals. It included helping in emergencies. Moses commanded in verse 4 that they should not see their brother's donkey or his ox fall down along the road and hide themselves from them. They should surely help him lift them up again. Moses then addressed something that might seem unusual to modern readers, but was important to God. In verse 5, he declared that a woman should not wear anything that pertained to a man, nor should a man put on a woman's garment, for all who did so were an abomination to the Lord their God. God had created the male and female for a purpose, and even their clothing should reflect this divine design. Environmental stewardship was also part of their responsibility. Moses gave them a law in verse 6 about protecting wildlife. If they came across a bird's nest along the way, in any tree or on the ground, with young ones or eggs, with the mother sitting on the young or on the eggs, they should not take the mother with the young. The reason was both practical and spiritual. In verse 7, Moses explained that they should surely let the mother go and take the young for themselves, that it might be well with them and that they might prolong their days. This ensured the species would continue while still allowing them to use what they needed. Even their buildings had requirements. Moses commanded in verse 8 that when they built a new house, they should make a parapet for their roof, that they might not bring guilt of bloodshed on their house if anyone fell from it. Safety wasn't optional. It was a moral obligation. Moses addressed agricultural practices in verses 9 through 11. They should not sow their vineyard with different kinds of seed, lest the yield of the seed which they had sown and the fruit of their vineyard be defiled. They should not plow with an ox and a donkey together. They should not wear a garment of different sorts, such as wool and linen mixed together. Finally, Moses gave them a distinctive way to remember God's commands. In verse 12, he told them to make tassels on the four corners of the clothing with which they covered themselves. Moses now turned to laws that would protect the most sacred human relationships. Marriage was the foundation of their society, and these laws would ensure its integrity and protect the innocent from false accusations and abuse. The first scenario Moses addressed was tragic but necessary. In verse 13, he spoke of a man who took a wife, and when he went into her, he detested her and charged her with shameful conduct and brought a bad name on her, and said that he took this woman, and when he came to her, he found she was not a virgin. This was a serious accusation that could destroy a woman's life and even lead to her death. Moses provided a way for families to defend their daughters. In verse 15, he explained that the father and mother of the young woman should take and bring out the evidence of the young woman's virginity to the elders of the city at the gate. The father would have the right to speak for his daughter. In verse 16, the father of the young woman would say to the elders that he gave his daughter to this man as wife, and he detested her. The father would continue in verse 17, "And look, he has charged her with shameful conduct, saying, 'I found your daughter was not a virgin. And yet these are the evidences of my daughter's virginity.'" Then they would spread the cloth before the elders of the city. If the evidence proved the woman's innocence, the man would face severe consequences. Moses explained in verse 18 that the elders of that city should take that man and punish him, and they should fine him 100 shekels of silver and give them to the father of the young woman because he had brought a bad name on a virgin of Israel. Moreover, the false accuser would lose the right to divorce. Moses declared in verse 19 that she should be his wife. He could not divorce her all his days. However, if the accusation proved true, the consequences were severe. Moses explained in verse 21 that they should bring out the young woman to the door of her father's house, and the men of her city should stone her to death with stones, because she had done a disgraceful thing in Israel, to play the harlot in her father's house. Adultery was treated with equal seriousness. Moses declared in verse 22 that if a man was found lying with a woman married to a husband, then both of them should die, the man that lay with the woman and the woman. So they would put away the evil from Israel. The laws also protected young women from sexual assault. Moses addressed in verse 23 a scenario where a young woman who was a virgin was betrothed to a husband, and a man found her in the city and lay with her. In this case, both would be stoned because she didn't cry out in the city where people could have helped her. But the law distinguished between consensual relations and assault. Moses explained in verse 25 that if a man found a betrothed young woman in the countryside, and the man forced her and lay with her, then only the man who lay with her should die. The woman was innocent because in the countryside, even if she cried out, there would be no one to save her. Moses also addressed situations where unmarried people became involved. In verse 28, he said that if a man found a young woman who was a virgin, who was not betrothed, and he seized her and lay with her, and they were found out, then the man who lay with her should give to the young woman's father 50 shekels of silver, and she should be his wife because he had humbled her. He could not divorce her all his days. Finally, Moses addressed a situation that violated basic family boundaries. In verse 30, he declared that a man should not take his father's wife, nor uncover his father's bed. Moses now outlined who could participate in the assembly of the Lord and the standards that would keep their community holy. These weren't arbitrary rules. They reflected God's character and the special calling of his people. In chapter 23, verse 1, Moses declared that he who was emasculated by crushing or mutilation should not enter the assembly of the Lord. This wasn't meant to be cruel to those who had suffered injury, but to distinguish Israel from pagan cultures that practiced such mutilation in their religious ceremonies. Children born outside of marriage also faced restrictions. Moses stated in verse 2 that one of illegitimate birth should not enter the assembly of the Lord. Even to the 10th generation, none of his descendants should enter the assembly of the Lord. Certain nations were permanently excluded because of their actions toward Israel. Moses explained in verse 3 that an Ammonite or Moabite should not enter the assembly of the Lord. Even to the 10th generation, none of their descendants should enter the assembly of the Lord forever. The reason for this exclusion was their hostility. In verse 4, Moses explained that this was because they did not meet them with bread and water on the road when they came out of Egypt, and because they hired against them Balaam the son of Beor from Pethor of Mesopotamia to curse them. But God had turned their intended curse into blessing. Moses reminded them in verse 5 that the Lord their God would not listen to Balaam, but the Lord their God turned the curse into a blessing for them, because the Lord their God loved them. The exclusion of these nations had a purpose. Moses commanded in verse 6 that they should not seek their peace nor their prosperity all their days forever. However, not all foreign nations were treated the same way. Moses showed mercy to others in verse 7, saying they should not abhor an Edomite, for he was their brother. They should not abhor an Egyptian, because they were an alien in his land. Time could heal some wounds. Moses explained in verse 8 that the children of the third generation born to them could enter the assembly of the Lord. Moses then turned to maintaining purity during military campaigns. In verse 9, he told them that when the army went out against their enemies, they should keep themselves from every wicked thing. Personal hygiene and cleanliness were part of spiritual purity. Moses commanded in verse 10 that if there was any man among them who became unclean by some occurrence in the night, then he should go outside the camp. He should not come inside the camp. The process for restoration was specific. In verse 11, Moses explained that when evening came, he should wash with water, and when the sun set, he could come into the camp. Even bodily functions required proper handling. Moses designated in verse 12 that they should have a place outside the camp where they could go out. Among their equipment, they should have an implement. When they sat down outside, they should dig with it and turn and cover their refuse. The reason was spiritual as well as practical. Moses explained in verse 14 that the Lord their God walked in the midst of their camp to deliver them and give their enemies over to them. Therefore their camp should be holy, that he might see no unclean thing among them and turn away from them. Moses also addressed the treatment of escaped slaves. In verse 15, he commanded that they should not give back to his master, the slave who had escaped from his master to them. He should dwell with them in their midst, in the place which he chose within one of their gates, where it seemed best to him. They should not oppress him. Moses continued with laws that would set Israel apart from other nations through their treatment of the vulnerable and their business practices. These weren't just moral suggestions. They were divine commands that would determine their success or failure as a society. Religious prostitution was strictly forbidden. In verse 17, Moses declared that there should be no ritual harlot of the daughters of Israel, or a perverted one of the sons of Israel. The pagan nations used temple prostitution as part of their worship, but Israel's worship would be pure. Moses was even more specific in verse 18, commanding that they should not bring the wages of a harlot or the price of a dog to the house of the Lord their God for any vowed offering, for both of these were an abomination to the Lord their God. Interest charges within the community were prohibited. Moses commanded in verse 19 that they should not charge their brother interest on money or food or anything that was lent for interest. This was revolutionary. Most ancient societies allowed unlimited interest rates that trapped the poor in permanent debt. However, business with foreigners operated under different rules. Moses explained in verse 20 that to a foreigner they could lend for interest, but to their brother they should not lend for interest, that the Lord their God might bless them in all to which they set their hand in the land which they went to possess. Vows to God were binding contracts. Moses commanded in verse 21 that when they made a vow to the Lord their God, they should not delay to pay it. For the Lord their God would surely require it of them, and it would be sin to them. but vows were voluntary. Moses clarified in verse 22 that if they abstained from vowing, it would not be sin to them. Whatever had gone out of their lips, they should keep and perform. For they voluntarily vowed to the Lord their God what they had promised with their mouth. Moses addressed property rights with a practical example. In verse 24, he said that when they came into their neighbor's vineyard, they could eat their fill of grapes at their pleasure, but they should not put any in their container. This allowed for immediate hunger to be satisfied without permitting theft. The same principle applied to grain fields. Moses explained in verse 25 that when they came into their neighbor's standing grain, they could pluck the heads with their hand, but they should not use a sickle on their neighbor's standing grain. Moving to chapter 24, Moses addressed divorce regulations. In verse 1, he said that when a man took a wife and married her, and it happened that she found no favor in his eyes, because he had found some uncleanness in her, and he wrote her a certificate of divorce, put it in her hand, and sent her out of his house, the marriage could end. But there were restrictions on remarriage. Moses explained in verse 4 that if she remarried, and that husband also divorced her or died, her former husband who divorced her could not take her back to be his wife after she had been defiled, for that would be an abomination before the Lord. Newlyweds needed time to establish their relationship. Moses commanded in verse 5 that when a man had taken a new wife, he should not go out to war or be charged with any business. He should be free at home 1 year and bring happiness to his wife whom he had taken. Basic necessities couldn't be taken as collateral for loans. Moses declared in verse 6 that no man should take the lower or the upper millstone in pledge, for he took one's living in pledge. Kidnapping carried the death penalty. Moses commanded in verse 7 that if a man was found kidnapping any of his brethren of the children of Israel and mistreated him or sold him, then that kidnapper should die, and they would put away the evil from among them. Moses addressed the proper procedures for handling disputes and ensuring that justice was carried out fairly. These laws would prevent both excessive punishment and inadequate consequences for wrongdoing. Skin diseases required careful handling by religious authorities. Moses commanded in verse 8 to take heed in an outbreak of leprosy, that they carefully observed and did according to all that the priests, the Levites, would teach them, just as he commanded them, so they should be careful to do. Moses reminded them of a historical example in verse 9, telling them to remember what the Lord their God did to Miriam on the way when they came out of Egypt. Even Moses' own sister had faced consequences for speaking against him. When lending to the poor, dignity had to be preserved. Moses commanded in verse 10 that when they lent their brother anything, they should not go into his house to get his pledge. They should stand outside, and the man to whom they lent should bring the pledge out to them. Special care was required for the destitute. Moses explained in verse 12 that if the man was poor, they should not keep his pledge overnight. They should certainly restore the pledge to him again when the sun went down, that he might sleep in his own garment and bless them, and it would be righteousness to them before the Lord their God. Workers' rights were protected. Moses commanded in verse 14 that they should not oppress a hired servant who was poor and needy, whether one of their brethren or one of the aliens who was in their land within their gates. Payment had to be prompt. In verse 15, Moses declared that each day they should give him his wages and not let the sun go down on it, for he was poor and had set his heart on it, lest he cry out against them to the Lord and it be sin to them. Individual responsibility was a key principle. Moses stated in verse 16 that fathers should not be put to death for their children, nor should children be put to death for their fathers. A person should be put to death for his own sin. Justice had to be impartial. Moses commanded in verse 17 that they should not pervert justice due the stranger or the fatherless, nor take a widow's garment as a pledge. The motivation for protecting the vulnerable came from their own history. Moses reminded them in verse 18 that they should remember that they were slaves in Egypt, and the Lord their God redeemed them from there. Therefore, he commanded them to do this thing. Even harvesting practices should show care for the poor. Moses commanded in verse 19 that when they reaped their harvest in their field and forgot a sheaf in the field, they should not go back to get it. It should be for the stranger, the fatherless, and the widow, that the Lord their God might bless them in all the work of their hands. Moving to chapter 25, Moses addressed physical punishment. In verse 1, he said that if there was a dispute between men and they came to court, that the judges might judge them, and they justified the righteous and condemned the wicked, then it should be, if the wicked man deserved to be beaten, that the judge would cause him to lie down and be beaten in his presence, according to his guilt, with a certain number of blows. But there were limits to punishment. Moses declared in verse 3 that 40 blows he could give him and no more, lest he should exceed this and beat him with many blows above these, and their brother be humiliated in their sight. Even working animals deserved consideration. Moses commanded in verse 4 that they should not muzzle an ox while it treaded out the grain. Moses addressed family obligations in verse 5. If brothers dwelt together, and one of them died and had no son, the widow of the dead man should not be married to a stranger outside the family. Her husband's brother should go in to her, take her as his wife, and perform the duty of a husband's brother to her. This practice, called levirate marriage, preserved family lines. Moses explained in verse 6 that the firstborn son which she bore would succeed to the name of his dead brother, that his name might not be blotted out of Israel. Moses now turned to one of the most beautiful ceremonies in Israel's religious calendar, the offering of first fruits. This wasn't just about giving God the first and best of their harvest. It was about remembering their story and declaring their identity as God's chosen people. In chapter 26, verse 1, Moses told them that when they came into the land which the Lord their God was giving them as an inheritance, and they possessed it and dwelt in it, they should take some of the first of all the produce of the ground, which they would bring from their land that the Lord their God was giving them, and put it in a basket and go to the place where the Lord their God chose to make his name abide. The ceremony involved a formal declaration to the priest. Moses instructed them in verse 3 to go to the one who was priest in those days, and say to him that they declared that day to the Lord their God that they had come to the country which the Lord swore to their fathers to give them. The priest would receive their offering, and then came the most important part, reciting their history. Moses told them in verse 5 that they should answer and say before the Lord their God, "My father was a Syrian, about to perish, and he went down to Egypt and dwelt there, few in number, and there he became a nation, great, mighty, and populous." The story would continue with their suffering and deliverance. In verse 6 they would say, "But the Egyptians mistreated us, afflicted us, and laid hard bondage on us." Then in verse 7, "Then we cried out to the Lord God of our fathers, and the Lord heard our voice and looked on our affliction and our labor and our oppression." The climax of the story was God's mighty deliverance. In verse 8 they would declare, "So the Lord brought us out of Egypt with a mighty hand and with an outstretched arm, with great terror and with signs and wonders." And finally, in verse 9, "He has brought us to this place and has given us this land, a land flowing with milk and honey." The ceremony concluded with gratitude and celebration. Moses told them in verse 10 that they would say, "And now, behold, I have brought the first fruits of the land, which you, O Lord, have given me." Then they would set it before the Lord their God, and worship before the Lord their God. The celebration extended to everyone. Moses commanded in verse 11 that they should rejoice in every good thing which the Lord their God had given to them and their house, they and the Levite and the stranger who was among them. Every third year had a special emphasis on caring for the needy. Moses explained in verse 12 that when they had finished laying aside all the tithe of their increase in the third year, the year of tithing, and had given it to the Levite, the stranger, the fatherless, and the widow, so that they might eat within their gates and be filled, then they would say before the Lord their God the words recorded in verses 13 to 15. This declaration was a solemn oath of obedience. They would say in verse 13, "I have removed the holy tithe from my house, and also have given them to the Levite, the stranger, the fatherless, and the widow, according to all your commandments which you have commanded me. I have not transgressed your commandments, nor have I forgotten them." Moses now described one of the most dramatic moments that awaited Israel in the Promised Land. A ceremony that would literally divide the nation between two mountains to declare the consequences of their choices. In chapter 27, verse 1, Moses, with the elders of Israel, commanded the people, saying that they should keep all the commandments which he commanded them that day. On the day when they crossed over the Jordan to the land which the Lord their God was giving them, they should set up large stones and whitewash them with lime. These stones would bear an important message. Moses commanded in verse 3 that they should write on them all the words of this law when they had crossed over, that they might enter the land which the Lord their God was giving them, a land flowing with milk and honey, just as the Lord God of their fathers promised them. The location was specifically chosen. Moses told them in verse 4 that when they had crossed over the Jordan, they should set up these stones, which he commanded them that day, on Mount Ebal, and they should whitewash them with lime. An altar would also be built there. Moses commanded in verse 5 that they should build an altar to the Lord their God, an altar of stones. They should not use an iron tool on them. They should build with whole stones the altar of the Lord their God, and offer burnt offerings on it to the Lord their God. The ceremony would include fellowship offerings and celebration. Moses told them in verse 7 that they should offer peace offerings and should eat there and rejoice before the Lord their God. The law would be clearly displayed. Moses commanded in verse 8 that they should write very plainly on the stones all the words of this law. Then came the dramatic moment when the nation would be divided. Moses explained in verse 12 that when they had crossed over the Jordan, these should stand on Mount Gerizim to bless the people: Simeon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, Joseph, and Benjamin. The other tribes would represent the consequences of disobedience. In verse 13, Moses said that these should stand on Mount Ebal to curse: Reuben, Gad, Asher, Zebulun, Dan, and Naphtali. The Levites would proclaim a series of curses to which all the people would respond. Moses began the list in verse 15. "Cursed is the one who makes a carved or molded image, an abomination to the Lord, the work of the hands of the craftsman, and sets it up in secret." And all the people would answer and say, "Amen." The curses continued through various sins: dishonoring parents in verse 16, moving boundary markers in verse 17, misleading the blind in verse 18, perverting justice for vulnerable people in verse 19, and various sexual sins in verses 20 to 23. The ceremony concluded with curses against violence and corruption. In verse 24, they would say, "Cursed is the one who attacks his neighbor secretly." In verse 25, "Cursed is the one who takes a bribe to slay an innocent person." And finally, in verse 26, "Cursed is the one who does not confirm all the words of this law by observing them." To each pronouncement, all the people would say, "Amen." Moses now painted the most vivid picture of blessing and curse in all of Scripture. What he was about to describe would determine Israel's entire future and serve as a prophecy that would be fulfilled with stunning accuracy throughout their history. In chapter 28, verse 1, Moses declared that if they diligently obeyed the voice of the Lord their God, to observe carefully all his commandments, which he commanded them that day, the Lord their God would set them high above all nations of the earth. The blessings would be comprehensive and overwhelming. Moses promised in verse 2 that all these blessings would come upon them and overtake them, because they obeyed the voice of the Lord their God. Moses listed blessing after blessing in verses 3 through 6. "Blessed shall you be in the city, and blessed shall you be in the country. Blessed shall be the fruit of your body, the produce of your ground, and the increase of your herds, the increase of your cattle, and the offspring of your flocks. Blessed shall be your basket and your kneading bowl. Blessed shall you be when you come in, and blessed shall you be when you go out." Military victory was promised. In verse 7, Moses declared that the Lord would cause their enemies, who rose against them, to be defeated before their face. They would come out against them one way and flee before them 7 ways. Economic prosperity would follow. Moses promised in verse 8 that the Lord would command the blessing on them in their storehouses and in all to which they set their hand. And he would bless them in the land which the Lord their God was giving them. Their identity as God's special people would be recognized worldwide. Moses declared in verse 9 that the Lord would establish them as a holy people to himself, just as he had sworn to them, if they kept the commandments of the Lord their God and walked in his ways. International respect would follow. In verse 10, Moses said that all peoples of the earth would see that they were called by the name of the Lord, and they would be afraid of them. Abundance would characterize every aspect of life. Moses promised in verse 11 that the Lord would grant them plenty of goods, in the fruit of their body, in the increase of their livestock, and in the produce of their ground, in the land of which the Lord swore to their fathers to give them. Weather patterns would serve them. In verse 12, Moses declared that the Lord would open to them his good treasure, the heavens, to give the rain to their land in its season, and to bless all the work of their hand. They would lend to many nations, but they would not borrow. Leadership among nations was promised. Moses declared in verse 13 that the Lord would make them the head and not the tail. They would be above only and not be beneath, if they heeded the commandments of the Lord their God, which he commanded them that day, and were careful to observe them. But then Moses' tone changed completely as he began to describe the consequences of disobedience. The curses would be as comprehensive as the blessings had been wonderful. In verse 15, Moses warned that if they did not obey the voice of the Lord their God, to observe carefully all his commandments and his statutes, which he commanded them that day, all these curses would come upon them and overtake them. The curses mirrored the blessings in reverse. Moses declared in verses 16 to 19, "Cursed shall you be in the city, and cursed shall you be in the country. Cursed shall be your basket and your kneading bowl. Cursed shall be the fruit of your body and the produce of your land, the increase of your cattle and the offspring of your flocks. Cursed shall you be when you come in, and cursed shall you be when you go out. Disease and disaster would follow. Moses warned in verse 21 that the Lord would make the plague cling to them until he had consumed them from the land which they were going to possess. Agricultural failure would bring famine. In verse 22, Moses said the Lord would strike them with consumption, with fever, with inflammation, with severe burning fever, with the sword, with scorching, and with mildew. They would pursue them until they perished. Even the weather would turn against them. Moses warned in verse 24 that the Lord would change the rain of their land to powder and dust. From the heaven, it would come down on them until they were destroyed. Military defeat would replace victory. In verse 25, Moses declared that the Lord would cause them to be defeated before their enemies. They would go out one way against them and flee 7 ways before them, and they would become troublesome to all the kingdoms of the earth. The prophecies became increasingly horrific, describing siege conditions so severe that Moses said in verse 53, "They would eat the fruit of their own body, the flesh of their sons and their daughters, whom the Lord their God had given them," in the siege and desperate straits in which their enemy would distress them. The ultimate curse would be exile from the promised land. Moses prophesied in verse 64 that the Lord would scatter them among all peoples, from one end of the earth to the other. And there they would serve other gods, which neither they nor their fathers had known. Wood and stone. The sun was beginning to set on Moses' life, and he knew this was his final opportunity to speak to the nation he had led for 40 years. What he said next would be his most urgent and heartbreaking message. A plea from a dying leader who could see into Israel's future. In chapter 29, verse 1, Moses called all Israel together and said to them that they had seen all that the Lord did before their eyes in the land of Egypt. To Pharaoh and to all his servants and to all his land. They had witnessed the great trials which their eyes had seen, the signs and those great wonders. But Moses knew something troubling about human nature. In verse 4, he told them that the Lord had not given them a heart to perceive, and eyes to see, and ears to hear, to this very day. Even after seeing the greatest miracles in history, their spiritual understanding was still limited. Moses reminded them of God's supernatural care during their journey. In verse 5, he said that he had led them 40 years in the wilderness, and their clothes had not worn out on them, and their sandals had not worn out on their feet. They had not eaten bread, nor had they drunk wine or similar drink, that they might know that he was the Lord their God. The recent victories proved God's continued power. Moses recounted in verse 7 how when they came to this place, Sihon, king of Heshbon, and Og, king of Bashan, came out against them to battle, and they conquered them. Now came the crucial moment. Moses declared in verse 9 that they should keep the words of this covenant and do them, that they might prosper in all that they did. He was establishing a new covenant ceremony in verse 10, telling them that all of them stood today before the Lord their God, their leaders and their tribes and their elders and their officers, all the men of Israel. This covenant included everyone. Moses continued in verse 11 that their little ones and their wives, also the stranger who was in their camp, from the one who cut their wood to the one who drew their water, were all included. The purpose was clear. In verse 12, Moses explained that they should enter into covenant with the Lord their God and into his oath which the Lord their God made with them today, that he might establish them today as a people for himself, and that he might be God to them, just as he had spoken to them, and just as he had sworn to their fathers, to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. But Moses was thinking beyond the present generation. In verse 14, he declared that he made this covenant and this oath, not with them alone, but with him who stood there with them that day before the Lord their God, as well as with him who was not there with them that day. Moses could see the future, and it frightened him. He warned them in verse 18 about the danger of individuals who might hear the words of this curse and bless themselves in their heart, saying that they would have peace even though they followed their own stubborn hearts. The Lord would not spare such a person. The consequences of national apostasy would be devastating. Moses prophesied in verse 23 that the whole land would be brimstone and salt and burning. It would not be sown, nor would it bear, nor would any grass grow there, like the overthrow of Sodom and Gomorrah, Admah and Zeboim, which the Lord overthrew in his anger and his wrath. Future generations would ask why this happened. Moses predicted in verse 24 that all nations would say, "Why has the Lord done so to this land? What does the heat of this great anger mean?" The answer would be simple and tragic, as Moses explained in verse 25. It was because they had forsaken the covenant of the Lord God of their fathers, which he made with them when he brought them out of the land of Egypt. But Moses wasn't ending his speech with despair. Even as he predicted Israel's failure and exile, he also saw something beautiful beyond the judgment, a hope that would sustain them through their darkest hours. In chapter 30, verse 1, Moses said that when all these things came upon them, the blessing and the curse which he had set before them, and they called them to mind among all the nations where the Lord their God drove them, and they returned to the Lord their God and obeyed his voice, according to all that he commanded them today, they and their children, with all their heart and with all their soul, then something amazing would happen. God's response to genuine repentance would be immediate and complete. Moses promised in verse 3 that the Lord their God would bring them back from captivity and have compassion on them, and gather them again from all the nations where the Lord their God had scattered them. No matter how far they were scattered, God would find them. Moses declared in verse 4 that if any of them were driven out to the farthest parts under heaven, from there the Lord their God would gather them, and from there he would bring them. The restoration would be complete. In verse 5, Moses promised that the Lord their God would bring them to the land which their fathers possessed, and they would possess it. He would prosper them and multiply them more than their fathers. But the greatest miracle would be internal transformation. Moses prophesied in verse 6 that the Lord their God would circumcise their heart and the heart of their descendants, to love the Lord their God with all their heart and with all their soul, that they might live. The curses would be transferred to their enemies. Moses declared in verse 7 that the Lord their God would put all these curses on their enemies and on those who hated them, who persecuted them. Their obedience would return along with their prosperity. Moses promised in verse 8 that they would again obey the voice of the Lord and do all his commandments, which he commanded them today. God would bless them abundantly. In verse 9, Moses said that the Lord their God would make them abound in all the work of their hand, in the fruit of their body, in the increase of their livestock, and in the produce of their land for good. For the Lord would again rejoice over them for good, as he rejoiced over their fathers. The condition was sincere repentance. Moses emphasized in verse 10 that this would happen if they obeyed the voice of the Lord their God, to keep his commandments and his statutes which were written in this book of the law, and if they turned to the Lord their God with all their heart and with all their soul. Moses wanted them to understand that this wasn't impossible. In verse 11, he told them that this commandment which he commanded them today was not too mysterious for them, nor was it far off. It wasn't hidden in heaven or across the sea. Moses explained in verses 12 to 13 that it was not in heaven that they should say, "Who will ascend into heaven for us and bring it to us, that we may hear it and do it?" Nor was it beyond the sea that they should say, "Who will go over the sea for us and bring it to us, that we may hear it and do it?" The word was close to them. Moses declared in verse 14 that the word was very near them, in their mouth and in their heart, that they might do it. Moses knew his time was running out. At 120 years old, with his strength still intact, but his mission nearly complete, he had to prepare Israel for life without him. The transition he was about to orchestrate would determine whether everything he had built would survive. In chapter 31, verse 1, Moses went and spoke these words to all Israel. He told them in verse 2 that he was 120 years old today and could no longer go out and come in. Also, the Lord had said to him that he would not cross over this Jordan. But Moses assured them that they wouldn't be abandoned. In verse 3, he declared that the Lord their God himself crossed over before them. He would destroy these nations from before them, and they would dispossess them. Joshua himself crossed over before them, as the Lord had said. The formula for victory was the same as always. Moses reminded them in verse 6 to be strong and of good courage. Do not fear nor be afraid of them. For the Lord their God, he was the one who went with them. He would not leave them nor forsake them. Then came the formal commissioning of Joshua. Moses called Joshua in verse 7 and said to him in the sight of all Israel, "Be strong and of good courage, for you must go with this people to the land of Canaan, land which the Lord has sworn to their fathers to give them, and you shall cause them to inherit it." Moses gave Joshua the same promise he had given the people. In verse 8, he told him that the Lord, he was the one who went before him. He would be with him. He would not leave him nor forsake him. Joshua should not fear nor be discouraged. But Moses had another crucial task, preserving the law for future generations. In verse 9, Moses wrote this law and delivered it to the priests, the sons of Levi, who bore the ark of the covenant of the Lord, and to all the elders of Israel. The law wasn't meant to be hidden or forgotten. Moses commanded them in verse 10 that at the end of every 7 years, at the appointed time in the year of release, at the Feast of Tabernacles, when all Israel came to appear before the Lord their God in the place which he chose, they should read this law before all Israel in their hearing. This public reading included everyone. Moses specified in verse 12 that they should gather the people together, men and women and little ones, and the stranger who was within their gates, that they might hear and that they might learn to fear the Lord their God and carefully observe all the words of this law. The purpose extended to future generations. In verse 13, Moses said that their children, who had not known it, might hear and learn to fear the Lord their God as long as they lived in the land which they crossed the Jordan to possess. But then God gave Moses some sobering news. In verse 14, the Lord said to Moses that his days approached when he must die, and he should call Joshua and present themselves in the tabernacle of meeting, that he might inaugurate him. The Lord's message to Moses contained a heartbreaking prophecy. In verse 16, the Lord told Moses that he would rest with his fathers, and this people would rise and play the harlot with the gods of the foreigners of the land, where they went to be among them, and they would forsake him and break his covenant which he had made with them. knowing that Israel would eventually rebel despite all his warnings. Moses was commanded to teach them a song that would serve as a witness against them. This wasn't just any song. It was a prophetic masterpiece that would tell Israel's entire story before it happened. In verse 19, the Lord commanded Moses to write down this song for himself and teach it to the children of Israel. Put it in their mouths, that this song might be a witness for him against the children of Israel. Moses understood the tragic irony. God explained in verse 20 that when he had brought them to the land, flowing with milk and honey, of which he swore to their fathers, and they had eaten and filled themselves and grown fat, then they would turn to other gods and serve them, and they would provoke him and break his covenant. The song would become their accuser. In verse 21, God said that when many evils and troubles had befallen them, this song would testify against them as a witness. For it would not be forgotten in the mouths of their descendants. For he knew the inclination of their behavior today, even before he had brought them to the land of which he swore. So Moses wrote the song that very day and taught it to the children of Israel. The song began in chapter 32, verse 1, with Moses calling on heaven and earth to listen. Give ear, O heavens, and I will speak, and hear, O earth, the words of my mouth. The song proclaimed God's perfect character. In verse 4, Moses sang, He is the rock, his work is perfect, for all his ways are justice, a God of truth and without injustice. Righteous and upright is he. But it also exposed Israel's future corruption. Moses sang in verse 5, They have corrupted themselves. They are not his children, because of their blemish, a perverse and crooked generation. The song recounted God's love for Israel. In verse 10, Moses sang that God found him in a desert land and in the wasteland, a howling wilderness. He encircled him, he instructed him, he kept him as the apple of his eye. But prosperity would lead to rebellion. Moses sang the tragic prediction in verse 15. But Jeshurun grew fat and kicked. You grew fat, you grew thick, you are obese. Then he forsook God who made him and scornfully esteemed the rock of his salvation. The consequences would be severe. Moses sang in verse 20 that God would say, I will hide my face from them. I will see what their end will be. For they are a perverse generation, children in whom is no faith. Yet the song also contained hope. Moses sang in verse 43, Rejoice, O Gentiles, with his people, for he will avenge the blood of his servants and render vengeance to his adversaries. He will provide atonement for his land and his people. When Moses finished reciting all the words of this song in the hearing of the people, he told them in verse 46 to set their hearts on all the words which he testified among them that day, which they should command their children to be careful to observe all the words of this law. Before his death, Moses had one final gift to give: individual blessings for each of the 12 tribes. These weren't just farewell wishes. They were prophetic declarations that would shape each tribe's destiny in the Promised Land. In chapter 33, verse 1, this was the blessing with which Moses, the man of God, blessed the children of Israel before his death. Moses began in verse 2 by describing God's magnificent appearance. The Lord came from Sinai and dawned on them from Seir. He shone forth from Mount Paran, and he came with 10,000s of saints. From his right hand came a fiery law for them. Moses declared God's love for his people in verse 3. Yes, he loves the people. All his saints are in your hand. They sit down at your feet. Everyone receives your words. Then Moses began the individual blessings. For Reuben, he said in verse 6, Let Reuben live and not die, nor let his men be few. Though Reuben would survive, This brief blessing suggested a diminished role compared to his birthright. Judah received a blessing of victory. Moses prayed in verse 7, "Hear, Lord, the voice of Judah, and bring him to his people. Let his hands be sufficient for him, and may you be a help against his enemies." Levi's blessing was extensive, reflecting their special role as priests. Moses said in verse 8, "Let your Thummim and your Urim be with your Holy One, whom you tested at Massah, and with whom you contended at the waters of Meribah." Benjamin was blessed with security. Moses declared in verse 12, "The beloved of the Lord shall dwell in safety by him, who shelters him all the day long, and he shall dwell between his shoulders." Joseph received the longest and most beautiful blessing. Moses prayed in verse 13, "Blessed of the Lord is his land, with the precious things of heaven, with the dew and the deep lying beneath." The blessing continued through verse 16, describing abundant fertility and strength. Zebulun and Issachar were blessed together in verse 18. "Rejoice, Zebulun, in your going out, and Issachar in your tents. They shall call the peoples to the mountain. There they shall offer sacrifices of righteousness." Gad was blessed as a warrior tribe. Moses said in verse 20, "Blessed is he who enlarges Gad. He dwells as a lion and tears the arm and the crown of his head." Dan was described in verse 22 as a lion's whelp. He shall leap from Bashan. Naphtali received a blessing of satisfaction and expansion in verse 23. "O Naphtali, satisfied with favor and full of the blessing of the Lord, possess the west and the south." Asher's blessing was particularly beautiful. Moses said in verse 24, "Asher is most blessed of sons. Let him be favored by his brethren, and let him dip his foot in oil." Moses concluded the blessings with a magnificent description of God's protection in verse 26. "There is no one like the God of Jeshurun, who rides the heavens to help you, and in his excellency on the clouds." The moment every Israelite had been dreading was finally at hand. Moses, the greatest leader in their history, was about to leave them forever. But even in his final hours, God had one last gift to give his faithful servant. In chapter 34, verse 1, Moses went up from the Plains of Moab to Mount Nebo, to the top of Pisgah, which was across from Jericho. This was the mountain God had chosen for Moses' final earthly experience, a place where he could see the fulfillment of God's promise, even though he couldn't enter it. What happened next was one of the most breathtaking moments in biblical history. The Lord showed him all the land. In verse 1, Gilead as far as Dan, all Naphtali and the land of Ephraim and Manasseh, all the land of Judah as far as the western sea, the south, and the plain of the valley of Jericho, the city of palm trees, as far as Zoar. This wasn't just an ordinary view from a mountaintop. God supernaturally enabled Moses to see the entire promised land in one panoramic vision. Every hill, every valley, every city that would belong to his people was spread out before him in perfect detail. As Moses gazed upon the land, God spoke to him for the final time. In verse 4, the Lord said to him, "This is the land of which I swore to give Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, saying, I will give it to your descendants. I have caused you to see it with your eyes, but you shall not cross over there." It was both a gift and a heartbreak. After 40 years of leading Israel toward this moment, Moses could see the destination, but not enter it. Yet there was something beautiful in God's mercy. He didn't leave Moses wondering what the promised land looked like. He showed him everything. What happened next was unlike any death in human history. Moses wasn't just going to die and be buried by his people like other leaders. God himself was about to take personal charge of Moses' final moments. In verse 5, Moses, the servant of the Lord, died there in the land of Moab, according to the word of the Lord. The phrase, according to the word of the Lord, suggests that even the timing of Moses' death was precisely as God had planned. But the most remarkable part was what came next. In verse 6, God buried him in a valley in the land of Moab, opposite Beth Peor. But no one knows his grave to this day. The Creator of the universe personally buried his faithful servant, and he chose to keep the location secret. This wasn't accidental. God knew that if people could find Moses' grave, they might turn it into a shrine and begin worshiping Moses instead of worshiping God. By hiding the burial place, God protected both Moses' memory and Israel's faith. The secrecy of the burial became one of the great mysteries of Scripture. For thousands of years, people have wondered where Moses was buried. But God has kept that secret perfectly. No archaeological discovery has ever revealed it, and no ancient map has ever marked it. Moses died in remarkable condition. Verse 7 tells us that Moses was 120 years old when he died. His eyes were not dim, nor his natural vigor diminished. At an age when most people would be completely helpless, Moses was still physically strong and mentally sharp. The timing was perfect. Moses had completed his mission exactly as God had planned. He had led Israel out of Egypt, through the wilderness, and to the edge of the promised land. He had given them God's law, established their society, and prepared them for conquest. His work was finished. When word reached the people of Israel that Moses was dead, the entire nation went into mourning. This wasn't just the death of a leader. It was the end of an era that would never be repeated in human history. Verse 8 records that the children of Israel wept for Moses in the Plains of Moab 30 days. So the days of weeping and mourning for Moses ended. This was the same period of mourning reserved for the most important figures, showing the profound respect and love the people had for Moses. Joshua was ready to take over leadership. Verse 9 tells us that Joshua, the son of Nun, was full of the spirit of wisdom, for Moses had laid his hands on him. So the children of Israel heeded him and did as the Lord had commanded Moses. But even with Joshua's capable leadership, everyone knew that something irreplaceable had been lost. The final verses of Deuteronomy contain some of the most powerful words ever written about any human being. Verse 10 declares that there has not arisen in Israel a prophet like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face. This wasn't just about Moses' role as a prophet. It was about the unique intimacy of his relationship with God. No other human being had ever spoken with God as directly and personally as Moses had. Moses' power was unmatched. Verse 11 records that no one was like him in all the signs and wonders which the Lord sent him to do in the land of Egypt, before Pharaoh, before all his servants, and in all his land. The plagues of Egypt, the parting of the Red Sea, the provision in the wilderness. These were demonstrations of divine power that had never been seen before or since. The final verse captures the full scope of Moses' authority. Verse 12 states that no one was like him in all the mighty power and all the great terror which Moses performed in the sight of all Israel. Moses hadn't just been a political leader or a military commander. He had been God's chosen instrument to reshape history itself. With these words, the book of Deuteronomy comes to an end. And so does the life of the greatest leader Israel ever knew. Moses was gone, but his words would echo through eternity, shaping not just Israel's future, but the destiny of the entire world. If this journey through Deuteronomy has opened your eyes to something new about God's Word, don't keep it to yourself. Hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss another biblical adventure. Share this video with someone who needs to hear these timeless truths. And let me know in the comments which moment from Moses' final speeches impacted you the most. The story of Deuteronomy proves that God's word isn't just ancient history. It's living truth that changes everything it touches. Until next time, keep seeking, keep learning, and keep discovering the incredible stories that shaped our world.